I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Garrison to introduce himself and to begin his discussion about his book and his views on the issues that are going on in the United States now. We hope you enjoy this. Dr. Garrison.
James, thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. And I want to welcome everybody who is coming to attend this seminar and this discussion. I wrote Chain to the System, and it came out in August of 2020. And my goal was context. I approach understanding criminal justice by putting it in the context of American history and American political history. Criminal justice is a policy outcome, like all other policy outcomes: Medicare, healthcare, funding, government funding, state, federal funding, decisions, all those kinds of decisions are all policy decisions. And criminal justice system is no different. Criminal justice system is the result of political decisions. Thinking about politics, let me put it in a context this way. Think about your concept of right and wrong, however you determine that, okay? When you put those thoughts together in a coherent thought about why something is right or something is wrong, and then you begin to enunciate that, that's political rhetoric. Your statement about what should be and what shouldn't be. When you take those ideas and you put it into a story or a narrative explaining how you see the world, that's political narratives. Political rhetoric and political narratives together, that's worldview. And worldview is what gets implemented, argued about in politics. That's why elections matter. Elections are choices between worldviews. Elections are choices between narratives. You believe A, the other side believes B. Elections are about which one prevails. Now, after elections comes politics and policymaking. Policymaking is decisions made and government does things. Government does things based on election results, which are based on narratives, which is based on rhetoric. My book goes into how political rhetoric, narratives, elections, and policymaking has produced the criminal justice system that we have now. The criminal justice system, in other words, did not beam down from another planet and start to implement in the United States. It has a 200+ year history of choices and political narratives that won or lost on any particular election cycle every 4 or 2 years. That's why elections matter. Okay, so my book was designed to go through American political history, American history generally, to give context to American criminal justice history. So I begin the book with slavery. 1619, slaves came to the United States. And make long story short, what I argue in the book is that when slavery was instituted in the United States, it was skin driven. Now, you had indentured servants, right? Whites coming from Europe, and they were a different system. Whites coming from Europe to the United States, they would say, okay, I will work for you for 6 years. And then you pay my way to come to the New World. And after 6 years, I leave. That was indentured service. Now, there was no doubt indentured service would definitely caught the short end of the stick. There was no doubt about that. But blacks came as slaves, they came as property. So that was the first distinction. Now, in the early 1600s through the middle 1600s, what began to shift is that Virginia, South Carolina, the southern colonies made the determination that slavery could only attach to blacks. And that's where it starts. Slavery could only attach to blacks. So slavery was an identifier of lower class, lower caste, and non-protection of the law. Okay, As that process began to develop, slaves began to outpopulate whites in the southern colonies, which produced a fear of uprising. And so laws were passed to make sure that blacks could not read, could not write, could not get together outside of church. And to enforce it came the slave patrols. The slave patrols had one purpose: to chase down runaway slaves, to keep down slave rebellions, and to get free blacks that were functioning in the system, because American slavery allowed for free blacks. Free blacks had to be kept under control. They could not start milling around with slaves and giving them the bright idea of freedom. All right, so both slaves, free and slave, were controlled by the law, were controlled by law enforcement. Now, I explain to my students that when you talk to African Americans, and one of the key things I talk about in the book is the fundamental difference between how blacks and whites see the criminal justice system. Whites tend to see the criminal justice system as just. Blacks tend to see the criminal justice system as unfair. Okay, the reason being is that blacks see the criminal justice system through history. We see the criminal justice system through 400 years of history going back to 1619, and that's the context we see the criminal justice system. Whites see the criminal justice system contemporaneously. So they see the criminal justice system here and now. They don't see it with a historical context, and we see it going back to 1619. That is one of our fundamental differences. All right. So coming back to the book, one of the things that I also get into is, as time goes on, poor whites and slaves are separated socially, politically, and economically, as well as legally. Now, Dr. King pointed that out when he was at Selma, and he said the thing is that whites were told, no matter how low you are still higher than blacks. You are still higher than the slaves. That mindset is what held slavery together, what made poor whites defend slavery when, as an economic matter, they had nothing to gain by slavery. But slavery said, no matter how poor you are compared to the rich aristocracy that was running slavery, you're still higher than blacks. That mindset, that culture, that political ideology, that legal concept flows from slavery to Civil War, after Civil War, Jim Crow, to criminal justice. The idea that blacks have to be controlled and that black suffering has less of a meaning than white suffering. All right. So as I discuss these various topics in the book, and then I bring us up to World War II and after World War II. Civil War, the civil rights movement comes in, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and in 15 years, we put Jim Crow in the dustbin of history. By 1968, the systematic, legal, constitutional, second-class citizenship of African Americans is ended 1968. All right. But 1960 also was bringing a different, a new kind of narrative. Okay, so now let's back up and let's go to the election 1964 with Johnson. Johnson wins a landslide, beating out Goldwater. Okay, but what that election did is that it settled in the Republican Party's social conservative ideology as the orthodoxy of the party. It got settled in 64 with Goldwater. Now, Goldwater lost, but Goldwater changed the party. All right. Starting now, keeping that in mind, let's go back to 1960. Starting 1960 through 1970. That decade had a major increase in crime in the United States. All right. Now, crime brings fear, and people want to be safe from crime. All right, then. The crime rate that was increasing was people's attention was being focused on the urban areas of America. Now, the problem is that the urban areas of America, various other reasons won't get into, but the book gets into, for various reasons, urban America by the 1960s was black and brown. And we are focusing in on crime. And now here comes the subtlety. Crime and black become synonymous within that decade. Politically and rhetorically, black and crime became synonymous. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That was clearly Goldwater's fault. Goldwater's the one that put those two together. It happened in 1964. No. The author of putting black and crime synonymously together as a rhetorical political concept, as a concept of social policy, that was Lyndon Johnson in his 1966 speech. Lyndon Johnson, 1966, goes for the joint session of Congress and tells them that his great society will reduce crime. One of the selling points of the Great Society was that crime is the result of social economic injustice, right? Okay, hold that thought. Let's back up a couple of years. 1964, 1965, Johnson pushes the Great Society and all the social programs that we know thereof. To sell it, he goes to African Americans at Howard University and gives the famous "freedom is not enough" speech, in which case he says that even though we have ended Jim Crow and slavery together is more than 200 plus years. And it is unfair to say to somebody who's been hobbled and not trained for the race, right, using a race analogy, and then all of a sudden one day take the chains off and take him untrained and hobbled and put him next to somebody who has been trained and say, run, go forth, and let justice prevail. Okay? Johnson establishes social liberals' orthodoxy that crime is socially derived, not individual based. So now you have the two major narratives being formed, right? Okay, now then, so to sell this idea of federal government spending money all over creation, Johnson says that one of the byproducts of increasing spending in Great Society is that these programs will go to social economic injustice, and that's what drives crime. By the way, crime in the urban neighborhoods, that's where blacks are. So he says the reason blacks are committing crimes is because of social injustice. If we deal with the social injustice, crime will drop. Johnson is the one that rhetorically puts together race and crime. He says the link is social injustice. All right then. So that's 65, 66. By 68 and 72, the Republicans say, you know what? I agree with you halfway. The Republicans say, I agree. Race and crime are linked. Blacks and crime are synonymous. The reason that it's synonymous is because they're deviant, and that's what prisons are for. Nixon shows up and gives us the war on drugs and tough on crime and law and order rhetoric. Now the Republicans have their orthodoxy set. The Democrats have their orthodoxy set. Both of them say race and crime are synonymous. The disagreement was on why. All right. The problem is now race and crime is linked in the American social political mindset, both before the Civil Rights Movement and after the Civil Rights Movement. Blacks are a problem to be solved. Republicans say that's what prisons are for. That's what personal responsibility is for. Democrats say, yeah, that's what social programs and dealing with poverty is for. But the problem is the rhetoric has made Black people the problem to be solved. So 1970s moves along, Nixon is victorious, and then Reagan is victorious. Reagan is Goldwater winning. That's why Reagan is the hero of the Republican Party, and they had been all the way up to Trump. If you ask Republicans, social conservatives, they all agreed the person that they admired and put on a pedestal was Reagan, because Reagan won in '80 and did a wholesale win in 1984 beating Mondale 49 states to 1, right? Up until Trump, all Republicans, all social conservatives said that Republican Party was the party of Reagan and then backing up the party of Lincoln. Trump has changed that, and we can get into that conversation later. All right, then, history moves on now. The history that I just jumped over is Clinton. So the Democrats were losing the political rhetoric idea that only Republicans were strong on crime, right? The Democrats were soft on crime. That's what Reagan gave us, and that's what Papa Bush gave us, right? With the Willie Horton ad. I hope we can talk about that story a little later. All right, then. Clinton shows up, and Clinton does a triangulate theory. Clinton comes and says the Democratic Party understands crime and wants to reduce crime. And Clinton gives us the 1994 Crime Act, right? Something that's been dogging the Democratic Party ever since. All right, hold that thought. Let me just back up 1 second. Reagan shows up, and Reagan gives us the Crime Act of '84, among other things, the sentencing guidelines. That was where the sentencing guidelines came from, and that's where the idea of taking from the courts the ability to determine what kind of sentence somebody should get was taken away from the courts. Mandatory minimum sentencing became the new philosophy in criminal justice. Then in '86, we have the Anti-Drug Act of 1986, and that's the 100-to-1 crack cocaine statute. And then in '88, he gives us the Anti-Drug Act of 1988, which gives us the minimum mandatory of 5 grams of crack, 5 grams of crack, 5 grams, 5 years in prison, mandatory minimum. Okay, then. Between Bush and Clinton, that was a time that African Americans were making up 50% of the total prison population in the United States. It was between those two presidents. The beginning of the increase was Reagan. Now here comes Clinton, okay? Clinton is totally into this law and order type thing, right? In spite of how he's gotten away with highway murder, right? Clinton gives us a 1994 crime bill. That gives us a 3 strikes and you're out bill. That was Clinton. That was not Reagan. He gives us a 3 strikes and you're out. The one that was even more significant than the 3 strikes and you're out was what he passed the following year, 1995. Now, because the 1994 crime bill is such a big achievement, the 95 bill gets missed. But I would argue the 95 bill is one of the main reasons African Americans are disproportionately locked up in prisons. All right, back up a little now in history. Backing up to the '88 bill and the '86 bill. 1 gram of crack cocaine is equal to 100 grams of powder cocaine. For various reasons I talk about in the book, crack cocaine is sitting in Black communities. Powder cocaine is sitting in white communities. All right, there's reasons for that, but let's just stay with the problem. So they make crack cocaine 100% more, 100 times more sanctioned than powder cocaine. And crack cocaine, powder cocaine is the same drug. All right, then you can see there's a problem with this. Then 5 grams of crack cocaine is 5 years in prison, period. There is no ifs, ands, buts, or suppose. All right, then. In 1995, the U.S. Sentencing Commission that got created in 1984 says that these 2 laws are having a disproportionate impact on the Black community. They want to put in a new rule for sentencing, saying that judges can take into account the disproportionate impact on the Black community when sentencing individual Black males, Black females, or anybody else using crack cocaine. Okay. So the Sentencing Commission, 1995, is saying that the '86 and '88 bills are having a disproportionate impact on Black people, period. No doubt. So what does Bill Clinton, Democrat, do? He pushes through Congress, the only time it's ever happened, a law overruling the Sentencing Commission. The Sentencing Commission in '95 wanted to change the impact of these two statutes. Clinton Clinton passed a statute overriding the Sentencing Commission. It had never happened before, and it's never happened since. It was under Clinton that when we could have stopped the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system, the '84 bill, the '86 and the '88 bill, it could have been dealt with in '95. Clinton specifically rejected it. All right, now talk politics for a minute. There's a reason why he did it. It's because the Democrats were getting clocked by the Republicans on presidential elections on the narrative that we were soft on crime. Clinton came in and stole the get tough on crime territory from the Republicans, and they've never owned it since. The reason the tough on crime rhetoric is now not party locked is because Clinton stole it from the Republicans when he did the '94 crime bill and the '95 override bill. Now remember also he was the one with the one strike and you're out in public housing. That was '96. Clinton, not Bush and not Reagan, said for public housing, if you have a criminal record, or here it comes, if you are caught using illegal drugs or arrested for using illegal drugs in public housing was required to throw not only you out, but the entire family. Theory being is that the family is responsible for the individuals. So if an individual is running drugs, the family is allowing it, and they need to be expelled from public housing. Clinton's theory was this: people who are poor have a right to be in an area that's crime-free. That was his argument. So anybody that is in public housing that is committing crimes does not have a right to be there. What Clinton killed in Democrat social liberal theory, the idea that housing is a right. It is not. After Clinton, housing is not a right. It is a privilege if you are living in public housing. It was Clinton that put that into our political dynamics as well as our social policy outcomes. That policy exists to this day. If you're in public housing and you are arrested and convicted for drugs, you can be expelled and your whole family goes with it. Supreme Court affirmed it in the early 2000s. All right. So that's going on. And then 2000s come around and the passion for, tough on crime is beginning to drop. And of course, 9/11 comes and 9/11 changes the world. Okay. George Bush in 2008 passes the Second Chance Act, which was basically the federal government would now consider supporting certain rehabilitation programs. The reason this bill matters is not so much what the bill did, is what the bill changed our politics. From 80, definitely 84, through 94 and into early 2000s, the idea of rehabilitation as a theory of what the government should do when dealing with offenders was washed. We believed in retribution, incapacitation, incarceration, revenge, banishment, and make sure they can't do it again. Rehabilitation was a distant fourth of the four. When Bush passed the Second Chance Act in 2008, that began to develop an idea that rehabilitation politically could be swallowed. The Republicans were easing up and the Democrats were easing up on the tough on crime rhetoric, and so was basically the population of the United States. Which brings us to Obama in 2010, passing the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010. The significance of that bill is that it changed the 100-to-1 ratio to 18-to-1. Trump comes around in 2018 with the First Step Act, which made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. Okay, everybody remember that commercial that Bush was running when Trump was running for the presidency, and he shows this black woman being released from prison, and her family is huddling around her and they're thanking her. She thanks Bush and all the rest of that. Okay, that comes from his 2018 First Step Act, which made Obama's Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 retroactive, which applied to her, and that's how she got out. So what the Fair Sentencing Act basically did is what the Sentencing Commission wanted to do in 95, is change the dynamics of sentencing and the disproportionate impact and apply to individual people. Also, when you went from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, the Fair Sentencing Act allowed the courts to re-sentence based on the new 18 to 1, taking into account the amount of years you've already spent in prison. So depending on how the math worked out and when you were convicted, you could be released based on the Fair Sentencing Act. Trump makes it retroactive, so now it applies to everybody going back to the 80s. All right then. So that is where my book goes. My book goes through history, and then it goes through various policy outputs and outcomes and discusses differences in how Blacks and whites see the criminal justice system and how the criminal justice system was built. So I'm going to stop talking now because I'm sure there are a whole lot of questions and concerns. So I'm open to questions. What shall we talk about? Thank you very much.
So,
look at the criminal justice system as the result of a political outcome. Now, with that said, when it comes to African Americans, history also matters because Black males are feared. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons for that. That's what I talk about in my book. But my point is, Black males are feared in society, and the level of fear will produce a different level of politics and a different level of statutes being written.
Yes.
Black fear is what created the 84, the 86, and 88 bills.
Black fear.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry.
No. Brother Harvey, did you have a question?
All sorts of issues. Okay. But let's just assume that it actually represents what people say it represents. Okay. If you look at all of the crimes that are committed, the only ones where percentage-wise Blacks commit more is homicide and robbery. The entire list of all the other UCR crimes, whites are the great majority of people doing those crimes. So here's one of the first things I would decollect. Even though, now remember, Johnson put Blacks and race together for a political reason to get his policies passed, right? To convince white people, you need to support this because if this is done, Blacks will commit less crimes. Okay. First thing is this: most crime is committed by whites. And when you look at crime, one of the other things that's significant in the fear dynamic is the whole issue of Black on Black crime and Black on white crime. Okay. So one of my answers to your question is that we actually know what the data says. Okay. Now, first, all crime is interracial. All crime is interracial. Statistically, if a Black man is shot, a Black man did it, obviously. Also, if a white man is shot, a white man did it, statistically. Because we're social creatures and we live together, if you get shot, robbed, or something, it is most likely a person that did it lives in your area, looks like you. That's why in criminal justice, if there's a burglary or a robbery, the police look within the first 10 square block area for the person who did it. Because criminals, like everybody else, do things where they're comfortable and where they know where everything is. All right. So I looked it up just to be interesting. 61% of crimes against whites are done by whites. 70% of crimes done to Blacks are done to Blacks. Now, the interracial issue. Whites account for 10% of crime done to Blacks. Blacks account for 15% of crime done to whites. There's a 5% variance. Now, you hear politics and people talk about, first we talk about Black on Black crime, and then they talk about Black on white crime. First, nobody wants to talk about white on Black crime, but that's a self-evident conversation to sit by itself. Okay, People talk about black on black crime, but look at what's being implied. Okay? These black people are savages. We need to control them because what the hell will they do to us if they come over here? That's what that black on black crime thing is. Okay? That's what it is. Because obviously there's black on black crime. Everybody knows that's what's supposed to happen. Just like white on white crime. Now the point is this. Why doesn't anybody want to talk about white on white crime? Why isn't it a thing? I mean, 70% of whites are shot, killed, raped, murdered, whatever by whites. Why isn't that a thing?
Doesn't support the narrative.
And there it is. That's the whole story. That's not the narrative people want to have. Conservatives don't want to have a white on white crime narrative. It don't fit. They want to talk about blacks on blacks. The reason is because of the implication. These savages are out of control. And we better do something, because what happens if they cross the street and come over here? Okay? Now, that fear, that mindset, and it's very subconscious. I'm not saying people sit there and actually physically think that way. But what I'm saying is that fear goes back to 1619. That's where it comes from. And it goes back to the 1960s. That's where it comes from. Fear of black males running wild. Okay? That's why we want them in church, or we want them in school, or we want them in prison. We can debate which of the three we want, but we want them in one of the three. Okay? All right. But nobody wants to talk about white on white crime because that doesn't fit the narrative, and you catch the whole point. Understanding the narrative will help you understand the politics and the policies. Let's just be clear, all right? Slavery was profitable once they figured it out, okay? Slavery was profitable, and it started with Virginia and tobacco, all right? Quick story. All right, then. So the colonies are starving to death. Nothing's working. And then they discovered tobacco, and tobacco grows all over creation. Now, here's the problem with tobacco. It requires large plots of land, now that they have, but it requires a whole lot of people to plant it, cultivate it, and pull it out of the ground in the hot sun. All right, they weren't going for it. So now slavery was existing 200 to 300 years before the colonies got into it. So let's be fair. All right, then. So slavery was introduced to the colonies, and they said, this works. So they dragged slaves to the colonies for the purpose of pulling tobacco out of the ground, because that was the cash crop that made the Southern aristocracy. All right, then. 200 years of that goes by. Revolutionary War comes. All right, then. Jefferson, who I have many issues with, but Jefferson said that slavery was an abomination. Now, blacks were lower class, and they were genetically and intellectually, but slavery was wrong nonetheless. That's the kind of mind Jefferson had. All right, then. So Jefferson says, Jefferson puts in the Declaration of Independence a clause that says that slavery is a crime imposed upon the colonies by the king. The Southern colonies tell Jefferson, take it out or we're not signing. The whole Declaration of Independence would not have happened if Jefferson demanded that clause to be there. Jefferson relented, they took it out, and the South went with the program. All right, then. History moves on for another 100 years. Civil War comes, Civil War goes. All right, the South is decimated. The Reconstruction, 10 years, and then the North abandons blacks. Southern Democrats take over. Jim Crow. Now we're into the late 1800s. Now, Brandon, I'm gonna come to your question. African Americans during Reconstruction pulled themselves together and built universities, hospitals, colleges, high schools, middle schools. They built black towns with everything in it. We were economically independent and viable during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction. White people weren't having it, and wiped whole black neighborhoods off the face of the earth. And that's where you had remember, race riots Black people starting them only happened in the 60s. From the late 1800s until the 1950s, when a race riot happened, white people started it and killed Black people. Okay? Black people starting race riots is a new thing in American history. All right. So coming back to your question about money, African Americans never were able to transfer money from one generation to another. That is where that's the beginning of our loss. All right. To put it in context, think about Joseph Kennedy. All right. Joseph Kennedy's money he made then makes the Kennedys now rich. That's how money works. In America, America is a fully functioning capitalistic system. It works. It works because one generation may catch most of the short end of the stick, but they buy a house, they buy land. Because in America, wealth is intergenerationally made. Wealth is intergenerationally transferred. Wealth just doesn't show up, right? Unless you're born in a rich family 2 generations ahead, you have to make it. All right, African Americans from the late 1800s until, all right, let's use 1968 as the basic clock. So that's 100 years, give or take. The wealth that any blacks made was never able to be transferred from one generation to another. Blacks never developed that history because that 100 years, Jim Crow ruled the world. Another point to think about when we're talking about money. 1865, America's a third-rate country just coming out of a civil war. Half the country's in rubble. 1945, America runs the world. Okay, that's about, I think, about 60-something years, whatever the number is, right? America goes from a third-rate country nobody's paying any attention to. 1945, America runs the world. Notice something. That period is also the golden age of Jim Crow. When America went from third rate to run the world, blacks were by law excluded from all of that historical growth, all that intergenerational growth. Right? Now you throw in redlining, restrictive covenants, all of those statutes that did not allow blacks to buy houses and transfer them to their kids, to be transferred to their grandkids. But whites were able to go from dirt poor house to second generation college educated. Third generation, now they're in Congress, the Senate, and President of the United States. The blacks didn't have that when the United States was growing, right? I talk about in the book, I ask a question. What would America look like if during Reconstruction, the idea of Reconstruction became paramount theory in America? In other words, blacks were allowed to build houses, build universities, build colleges, build wealth, and be able to live and transfer it from one generation to another like whites were, and the law applied to them equally properly. What would have happened? Black presidents would be no more fascinating than apples on apple trees. It would just be a thing. I mean, look what we did. 40 years after 1968, we put somebody in the White House. Only took 40 years. 200 and change years of Jim Crow, 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow. And in 40 years, we produce a president. Now remember, 1948, you need to pass a law to allow a black man to go into a white neighborhood and buy a house he could own. 40 years later, a black man walks into the White House. It's not like we don't have it. Once left alone, we could produce wealth. Today, you can find black neighborhoods in places where the poorest person is living in an $800,000 house, right? So African Americans can create wealth and transfer it from one generation to another. We are behind because we were kept behind for 100+ years. And the money that could have been was lost. Now, to answer your last question, then I'll stop. is don't overlook the impact of African Americans not being able to enjoy the GI Bill and the rise of the suburbs and blacks being isolated from them. Because remember, wealth in a capitalistic society like the United States is intergenerationally created. The GI Bill, when it came, right, the greatest generation, which they were, come back from World War II, right? And money falls out of the sky. We are sending all of them to college. We are giving them all middle-class jobs, and we are setting up housing, and we're practically giving loans away so that they could buy a house. Okay? So the people living today are the grandchildren of World War II vets who were given free mortgages and free education, which produce strong families, which produce stable communities, which gives the kids better chances to go to better schools, and then they graduate and go to Harvard, and then they have kids, and then all of a sudden their grandkids are now in the presidency of the United States. All right then. Black soldiers were isolated from the GI Bill in toto. So that generational transfer of wealth was was stolen from us. Then when you talk about blockbusting and other ways that the federal government used housing laws to make sure that blacks were in small areas and then downgraded the value of those areas and the housing of those areas, black wealth wasn't able to grow over the last 40, 50 years.
True.
And that is one of the problems our community is still dealing with. The wealth that we could have had, we didn't develop because we were isolated and restricted from doing it. The wealth that we did have from the Civil War forward was wiped right off the face of the earth in good old-fashioned white racist riots, right? We know in criminal justice, if you bump into the criminal justice system at 13, 14 years old, you are more likely to bump into it again and again and again and build a criminal record. On the other hand, if you can get to 18 years old and never bump into the criminal justice system, you will never see it unless you come work for it. The school to prison pipeline and that zero tolerance you were talking about is absolutely correct. Because what happened is this. Part of the problem is I don't think schools and the way we teach white female and then white male how to deal with our kids, I don't think we teach them how to deal with them properly. So they misconstrue activity with threat. Now, when you add to that the general concept of blacks are a threat, period, and a threat to white women in particular, and that explains all sorts of things like lynching, but that's a different conversation, right? What happens is boisterous black males are considered not boisterous, but incorrigible and difficult. Now they get stamped that way. So now the teacher tells the little guy to do something, and so he's boisterous, so he's not having it. She calls a school resource officer this big, this cop 4 times the kid's size. The kid stands his ground, and then they suspend the kid for fighting. The suspension ends him up in truancy court. And then all sorts of things begin to go south. Okay, or the other problem, with zero tolerance, the other problem is, okay, he gets suspended for 4 weeks. All right. We know on the college level, if you miss 4 weeks of class, a whole semester's lost. Okay, so now the little guy fails. So now the little guy has to process in his head the failure. He processes it, I'm not stupid, although other people say that he is stupid. So now he acts out to deal with that issue. Now the whole circle starts all over again. Eventually he is suspended too many times, he's expelled. Now where does he go? Now he goes to alternative education school. Okay, that could go worse. Now he begins to be around other kids who have behavioral issues. And of course, we all know, both as parents and just as we all know, we are the people we hang around. That's why mom and dad said, don't hang with him because he's no good. That's why it said, that a rotten apple will waste the whole barn. All right then. So now he's hanging with the wrong people, does the wrong thing, and now he gets arrested for something. All right, now here comes the problem. The first arrest, the criminal justice system doesn't do a whole lot. He'll get probation or something. He thinks the criminal justice system is a joke. Now he acts up more, a couple of rotations, and now he's a chronic offender. And now when he does something and now the system wants to take him seriously, they look at his record. He's got 25 arrests for this and a couple of things for that. They think he's incorrigible, and all of a sudden, instead of getting 2 years of a 0 to 7 year sentence, now he gets 6 years to 10 years. And now he's got a chronic problem. Now he's in prison. He comes out, and of course with collateral sanctions. Now he doesn't get jobs. He can't live where he wants because you can discriminate against somebody who has a felony conviction the way you could not discriminate against anybody else, and bang, there's no way out. So the school to prison pipeline is school failure into juvie, into adult, and if something doesn't break that chain, you never get out of it. That's where repeat offenders come from, right? So now going back to one of the reasons that this exists is you're absolutely correct with the 1994 crime bill and this idea of zero tolerance. The idea we need to put all these criminals out of schools so children that want to learn can learn. Okay, that rhetoric really sounds good, but the problem is the only people you're putting out are Black and Hispanic kids. And so you're absolutely correct. That is where that continuous problem comes from. Now remember also under Clinton, it's bad enough your kid gets thrown out of school. So obviously you as a parent are not doing well. Now, if this kid is thrown out of school, he's hanging around the housing complex all day while everybody else is going to work. Well, what's he going to do? He's going to hang around with other people who are not in school. And then somebody gets some crack, somebody gets some drug, and then somebody gets caught. Next thing you know, the whole entire family now is thrown out of public housing. So these narratives produce a policy that can produce outcomes that people did not think would happen when they produced the policy. Because I don't think in 94 and 95, people were sitting saying, okay, we're really going to get these Black people now. We're just going to just screw them all over the place with different type of things. I don't think that's how it happened. But the narrative of the get tough on crime with the subtle undercurrents of, well, we're only talking about Blacks anyway, so who cares about their suffering, is what produced this chronic problem that African Americans are dealing with. And coming back around, the modern incantation of all of this in the modern times is police shootings. I don't think they sat there in a Klan rally and said, these things will put more Blacks in prison, and these things will decimate the Black community. And that's why we're going to pass these statutes. I'm saying that's not how the thinking happened. What I'm saying, though, is that the policy outcomes of these policy outputs produced those results. But within that context, I also fully assert that there's an underlying current that Blacks are a problem. Blacks are something to be feared. And that underlying current is 1619 forward. You can't start in 1980 and find that current. That current is 1619 and it flows through our history. One of the things that's significant about this summer that occurred with the Floyd lynching is that the generation that's coming up now doesn't have that fear and that political narrative floating around in their subconscious the way their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents did. This generation has a different thing going on in their head. And so I think certain issues that we had to deal with and dealing with, I think are going to not find the same resonance with young generation coming up now, right? Think of it this way. Think of all the culture war issues we remember in the 80s and 90s. Remember all of them? None of them are going on now. Some of those wars, social conservatives lost and they know it. The only one they're still holding on to is abortion. That one they're holding on to, and they've resurrected Second Amendment. And Second Amendment has a crime fear issue and a government fear issue. That's where that comes from, right? But think about the other cultural wars that made Buchanan, and Reagan, and Bush. Those are gone, and the conservatives know it. They're not even bringing up some of those wars. This generation that's coming up didn't have to fight those wars. This generation coming up doesn't instinctively look at Black people and see something to be feared or worried about. So this generation, at least compared to the past generation, so this generation doesn't have that thing. My hope is, and we teach this generation, so there's a reason why we have this hope. This generation, the generations coming up behind them, have a different narrative of seeing America and seeing the world. So it's an injustice that Black people are getting shot by police. We all remember when we had to convince America that it was an injustice, right? In the 80s and the 90s, you had to convince both white social conservatives, and I use that as a worldview, not a particular set of people. I use that as a worldview. You had to convince white social conservatives. You had to convince certain liberals that Blacks being shot by police, Blacks being incarcerated at 50% of the total prison population was a problem, right? Okay, today, you don't have to convince people that's a problem. The argument is about how to fix it. Okay, that's an improvement. That's an improvement, right? Bear arms separated from the militia. All right, the Supreme Court has settled that those two things can be decoupled and that there is an individual standing right to the right to bear arms. I have no problem with people having weapons. I have no problem with it on a constitutional level. I have no problem with it on a personal level. The reason that the white social conservative worldview, my opinion, about the right to bear arms is that it's built on the fear of either the federal government swooping down and taking away their rights, or Black people getting out of hand and crime, and they need to be able to protect their families from criminals. White social conservatism looks at the Second Amendment as a way to protect themselves from either the hordes or the government. It's the reason why they support the Second Amendment that bothers me. Because that means they're still holding on to this idea that the federal government, and the reason they resent the federal government, let's be clear, they resent the federal government because the federal government in the 1950s and the 1960s prevented them from saying segregation was their right to do, right? As Eisenhower sending the army down to Little Rock, it's Kennedy sending the U.S. Marshals down to Mississippi that rubbed them the wrong way. It was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, and 68. That's the federal government that rubs them the wrong way. Just like generations past, it was the federal government telling them that you can't extend slavery into the Western states. That's where that comes from.